Before this story begins, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because the stories shared here aren't just entertainment. They are mirrors. And sometimes what we see reflected back at us changes us forever. When my husband drove away that winter morning, he promised it would only be for 2 weeks. Just 2. A short job in the city. A temporary contract. Good money. Then home again. I stood on the porch as his truck rolled down the long dirt road, the tires crunching over frozen gravel, the sound fading until it disappeared completely. I waved until the truck was gone, until there was nothing left to wave at. I didn't realize then that the quiet that followed would become the loudest thing in my life. The farm felt different without him. Not broken. Not abandoned. Just hollow. Every room felt larger, as if the walls had subtly moved outward overnight. The ceilings felt higher. The corners darker. Sound behaved differently too. The clock in the kitchen didn't just tick. It echoed. The wind didn't simply pass the house. It whispered through cracks in the siding, rattled loose boards, brushed against the barn doors like fingertips testing boundaries. At night, even the animals seemed louder, their distant movements settling into the dark, as if the whole land knew it was missing one of its anchors. I kept busy on purpose. That's what lonely people do. They disguise the ache as productivity. I cleaned things that weren't dirty, reorganized drawers that hadn't been opened in months, cooked full meals I barely touched. I told myself the heaviness in my chest was just boredom, just the adjustment period. But loneliness doesn't announce itself loudly. It slips in quietly, through cracks you don't even know exist. And by the time you notice it, it's already made itself comfortable. The barn had always been his place, his domain, his sanctuary. I rarely went there alone. It wasn't forbidden, just unfamiliar without him, too closely tied to his presence. But that week, with the house feeling like it was slowly closing in on me, I found myself drifting toward it. Not deliberately, not consciously, just drawn. The smell of hay hit me first. Ersi, drai, familiar. The soft creak of wooden beams overhead. The rhythm of a place that didn't rush. I told myself it grounded me, that it reminded me of stability, of routine, of him. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. That evening, just as the sun began to sink behind the fields, I noticed something that made me stop cold. Light. A warm, soft glow spilling from inside the barn. I froze where I stood. My first instinct was fear. The second was confusion. My husband wasn't supposed to be back for days. I stood there longer than I should have, my heart beginning to beat louder with every second that passed. Each step toward the barn door felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was asking me to reconsider. Inside I could hear movement. Not hurried. Not secretive. Just present. Someone was there. When the figure turned toward me, I exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and something I didn't yet have a name for. It was Daniel, my husband's old friend. He'd helped around the farm before, especially during heavy seasons, when extra hands made the work lighter. I hadn't known he'd be stopping by. I didn't mean to startle you, he said calmly, his voice steady, almost familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. Your husband asked me to check on the equipment. I nodded too quickly, too eager. Relief washed over me. But it wasn't alone. Something else came with it. Something warmer. Something quieter. Something dangerous. We talked longer than necessary. About the farm. About the weather. About my husband's job. About nothing. The pauses between our words stretched, thick and unhurried, filled with things neither of us said out loud. He listened. Not politely. Not absently. But in that rare way that makes you feel like your words actually land somewhere. When I finally left the barn, the cold evening air didn't cool the warmth that had settled under my skin. I told myself it was harmless. Just conversation. Just loneliness playing tricks on my mind. But that night, lying alone in our bed, the silence pressed heavier than ever. And no matter how I shifted the blankets, no matter how tightly I closed my eyes, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the barn, and how my husband's absence had quietly made space for something I wasn't ready to name. Daniel started coming by more often after that. Always with a reason. A fence post leaning just a little too far. A gate that refused to latch properly. A tractor making a sound that didn't sit right. Practical things. Harmless things. At least, that's how they sounded when I repeated them to myself. I never invited him. That mattered to me. I clung to that detail like proof of innocence. He just showed up. And I never asked him to stay. He just did. We worked while we talked. Or maybe we talked while we worked. The distinction blurred quickly. The rhythm of farm life has a way of softening conversation, making silence feel natural instead of awkward. He asked questions, not the kind people ask to fill space, but the kind that open doors. How long had my husband been gone? Was I used to the quiet yet? Did the nights feel longer? When I spoke about the house, how it echoed, how evenings stretched endlessly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't tell me to stay busy or think positive. He just listened. And somehow, that felt more intimate than touch ever could. That understanding scared me. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It felt easy. There were small moments I told myself didn't matter. Our hands brushing while passing tools. Our shoulders nearly touching as we leaned over the same task. The way his gaze lingered half a second too long before he looked away. Each time my breath caught. Each time, I pretended not to notice. At night, I started listening for the sound of his truck. More than I waited for my husband's calls. That realization unsettled me. Guilt didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in slowly. Not sharp, but heavy. I told myself emotional closeness wasn't betrayal. I wasn't touching him. I wasn't crossing that line. But lines aren't always drawn in bold ink. Sometimes they fade quietly. Until one day you look around. And realize you're standing far from where you started. One afternoon, the sky darkened without warning. A storm rolled in faster than forecasted. The wind whipping across the fields. Rain hammering down before either of us could react. We took shelter in the barn. The sound of rain against the metal roof was deafening. A constant roar that sealed us off from the rest of the world. It felt like being inside a held breath. We stood too close. Not touching, but close enough to feel heat. Close enough to sense each other's presence. Without needing to look. I know this is dangerous, he said quietly. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. I should go, I replied. But I didn't move. The silence between us thickened, charged with everything we refused to name. When I finally stepped back, it felt like tearing something fragile. Something that had formed without permission. That night, my husband called. His voice crackled through the phone. Tired and distant. He said he missed me. I said it back. But the words felt wrong in my mouth. Because somewhere between the barn and the quiet house, my heart had started telling a different story. One I was afraid to finish. When my husband's return was delayed, something inside me shifted. Not relief. Something worse. It felt like permission. Even though I had never asked for it. Daniel came by late that evening. He said he needed to secure the animals. Before another storm arrived, I followed him to the barn. Without thinking. The air felt heavier than usual. Charged. We didn't talk much. Words felt unnecessary. Even dangerous. Every step echoed like a warning. When he stopped and turned toward me, there was no surprise left. Only truth. I won't pretend this is innocent anymore, he said. Neither did I. The choice wasn't sudden. It was built quietly. Layer by layer. Every shared look. Every conversation stretched too long. Every night I'd felt unseen. Still, when I leaned into him, my heart pounded with fear and relief all at once. What happened between us wasn't rushed. It wasn't reckless. It was slow, careful, filled with hesitation and longing. Not driven by passion alone, but by something deeper. Connection. Vulnerability. The ache of being wanted. When you feel forgotten. In that moment, I wasn't a wife waiting at home. I was a woman making a choice. Afterward, the barn felt different. Not romantic. Not safe. Just real. The weight of what we'd done settled over us. Like dust hanging in the air. I never meant to hurt anyone. I whispered. Neither did I, he replied. But intentions don't erase consequences. When I walked back to the house alone, every step felt heavier than the last. I washed my hands, changed my clothes, stared at my reflection longer than usual. I looked the same, but I wasn't. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I knew this wasn't something I could undo. The story of my marriage now held a chapter that could never be erased. And the hardest part wasn't the fear of being caught. It was knowing that, for a moment, I had felt more alive than I had in years. That my husband came home 3 days later. 3 ordinary days. That's what made it unbearable. His truck pulled into the driveway just before sunset, dust rising behind it like nothing in the world had shifted. I watched from the kitchen window, my hands resting on the counter. My heart beat loud enough that I was sure he'd hear it the moment he stepped inside. He walked through the door with the same familiar smile, the same tired shoulders, the same warmth in his eyes. He hugged me like nothing had changed, like the space between us was still empty, like it hadn't been filled with silence and weakness, and a choice I could never take back. I hugged him too. I held him longer than usual, not out of affection, but out of fear, because I was carrying something heavier than any suitcase he'd brought home. Daniel didn't come by again. Not that week. Not the next. The barn returned to being just a barn. Wood. Echoes. Life moved forward the way it always does. Quietly, without asking permission. Meals were cooked. Conversations happened. Laughter returned in small, careful doses. From the outside, everything looked normal. But underneath, something fundamental had shifted. I noticed it in small ways. The way I flinched when my husband touched my shoulder unexpectedly. The way guilt sat with me at the dinner table. A silent guest I couldn't send away. I realized then that infidelity doesn't always announce itself with passion or drama. Sometimes it grows out of absence, out of long nights, out of quiet homes, out of feeling invisible for too long. I didn't confess. Not because I felt no guilt, but because I understood something I hadn't before. The truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just destroys. I knew telling him wouldn't bring clarity. It wouldn't undo what had happened. It wouldn't restore what we'd lost. It would only replace silence with devastation. So I carried it. Every day. Some nights, I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, wondering how 2 people could be so close and still be separated by something unspoken. I became hyper-aware of myself. Every word I chose, every reaction I had, every expression in my face. Guilt has a way of making you a careful person. Winter passed. Spring came slowly, bringing green fields and longer days. From the outside, it looked like renewal. Inside me, it felt like reckoning. I thought often about that winter, about the woman I was when my husband was gone, about the man in the barn who saw parts of me I had forgotten existed. I didn't romanticize it anymore. Time stripped it of its softness, left only clarity. What remained wasn't longing. It was understanding. And understanding, I learned, can be its own kind of punishment. I began to see my marriage differently, not as something broken by one moment, but as something that had been quietly neglected. Long before the barn, we had stopped seeing each other, stopped asking questions that mattered, stopped noticing the silence growing between us. None of that excused what I did, but it explained how I got there. That distinction mattered to me, not to justify myself, but to make sure I never became that woman again. Some stories don't end with confrontation. Some don't end with forgiveness or separation. Some end with awareness, with a quiet understanding that choices leave marks, even when no one else can see them. I still walk past the barn. It no longer pulls at me the way it once did. It stands as a reminder, not of desire, but of how easily silence can reshape a life, and how important it is to listen before the quiet becomes too loud. Some choices don't explode your life. They don't shatter homes overnight. They don't leave visible ruins behind. Some choices change you quietly. They settle into your memory. They reshape how you listen, how you love, how you sit with silence. That winter taught me something I wish I had learned another way. That neglect can be louder than conflict. That loneliness doesn't always scream. And that emotional distance can be just as dangerous as desire. I live with that understanding now. Not as a punishment, but as a responsibility. Because the barn was never the real mistake. The real danger was everything I ignored before I ever stepped inside it. Thank you for listening. If this story made you feel something, pause, reflect, or recognize a part of yourself, subscribe to the channel. More real stories, more quiet truths, more moments we don't talk about, but should.